Well, welcome everyone today for a very special event here in the history of Skokie. We're here to reflect on Gene Sarazen, 7-time major champion. And to do that, we're joined by his daughter, Marianne Sarazen, and longtime head golf professional at Skokie Country Club, Bill Erfurth. It's very difficult in starting this to totally encapsulate the life of Gene Sarazen and what he meant to golf. But just a few notable accomplishments that I'll start with, just to give you a sense for his career. He's one of 5 players to win each of the majors, includes Hogan, Player, Nicklaus, and Woods. As I mentioned, he won 7 majors, 2 U.S. Opens in 1922 and 1932, 3 PGA Championships, 1922, 23, and 33. Won the Open Championship in 1932 and the Masters in 1935. He had 48 professional wins. He played in an astonishing 115 majors. And of those 115 majors, he made the cut an astonishing 81 times. He was inducted in the World Golf Hall of Fame in 1974. So Marianne, we'll start with a very simple question. Gene Sarazen, is that his real name?
Oh, yes. Back, like a little idea why he changed his name. He was born Eugenio Sarazen, and he won his first tournament when he was about 18 years old, and it sounded like a violin player, not a professional golfer. So he decided to change it, and he spent a lot of time going through a telephone book, and he couldn't find any name with that spell. So that's how he changed his name.
Was there anything else behind him wanting to change his name that it sounded like you said, a violin player?
Yes. Well, you know, it was difficult as he was growing up in Westchester County because people of Italian and Irish descent were really not accepted at the clubs, and he felt that. And so he decided that he had to change his name if he was going to make a name for himself in the golf world.
And how did your dad start in golf?
Well, he came from a very, very poor family, and found out that in order to make a little money, he could become a caddy. But he also discovered that he could play golf, and he was really very young, and he would make his own golf club. And then he got to play not much. You know, he'd go over the fence of the club with a couple of friends, and they would hit a few balls until they got caught and whatever. But he found out at a very early age that he had a gift, and he did have a gift. He could hit a ping pong ball, he could hit a baseball. When we were kids in upstate New York, I was a teenager, my brother was, we would have our friends come over, you know, as kids do, and we discovered that we could line up 4 or 5 golf balls and give him one of those old, just plain old broom that swept in the kitchen. And he could take that and he could just go right down the line and hit every one of them and go right up in the air, right straight down there as if he was, and we thought that was the biggest deal.
That's really neat. Yesterday we had the good fortune of having lunch, and you had shared with me a story of one of your earliest memories of your dad, and it had to do with a goat on the farm.
Oh.
So I think that's a story I'd love for you to share again.
Well, we lived up in Connecticut. We had a dairy farm, and they thought it would be kind of fun. There was a lot of grass and a lot of weeding in the gardens, and they thought it would be kind of helpful and be fun to have pet goats. So my brother and I had a couple of these little pet goats, and there was one in particular that Dad really liked. And he would take this little goat kind of by the horns and get up close to its face and play with it like you would any kind of a little dog or a little pet. Well, the goat liked poison ivy. and Dad got poison ivy all over his hands, his arms, and all over his face. And that year he was supposed to go and play in the U.S. Open. Now that would have been back in the 40s, and needless to say, then he tried to fix it. He went out and got some poison ivy killer. He thought if he could put that on his arms, that would take care of it. So my mother had quite a mess to handle.
And for those of us who've not had the privilege of meeting your dad, describe who Gene Sarazen was, the person.
Well, he wore a shirt and a tie and a jacket to the day he died, and his knickers. He always was quite dressy. He loved to know what we were all doing. He loved to town with food. He would go. We went to Florida every year from the time I was 18 months old. We went to Florida, and then I don't know.
Did you have a connection with Florida? Or why you would travel there as a family?
You couldn't play golf up in Connecticut and New York in the wintertime. So we went down. He went down every year, and we went down until I was in about 5th grade. And we'd start school down there, and then come back and finish up wherever we were living in upstate New York at that time.
Now, one of the things that you mentioned is that he was a sharp dresser, and I think that's something that any of us who have seen him perform when he did the Shell Wide World of Golf, or we've seen him interviewed and perform footage. In fact, this is a great example here, this wonderful painting on loan from the USGA. Talk a little bit about his style of wearing his, what I would call a trademark +4s.
He got that from going to England for the Opens. He loved that wool. He liked wool. Those were always wool socks and wool sweaters, and he liked the look of and the knickers, because he was short, and he liked the knickers to play golf in. Apparently it was quite comfortable for him, and it just became his trademark.
Yeah. Where did he buy these knickers? Did he have his own personal tailor?
Well, the ones I remember there was a company by the name of DeFini's out of New York, and for years they made his, I would say that all of his outfits that he wore during the Shell's Wonderful World of Golf all came from DeFini. Those were all DeFini clothes. And Scott, when he got his socks, and then there was a company in Japan at the end of the 70s that did a tournament for 23 years in honor, and they made all his clothes at that time.
That's remarkable. And what about his hats? I always picture, you see several pictures of Gene Sarazen. He always had a very nice hat on. Where did he get those hats?
Well, with his association with the Japanese, they created that white hat, and I think you have a picture of it here. And that logo, and it kind of became his style. He liked that.
Now, Bill, you played in a couple of events where Gene Sarazen also played. What were your first recollections of meeting Gene Sarazen?
Well, I didn't meet him in 1958, but I understand from talking to you just a while ago that we played in the same U.S. Open in 1958 at Southern Hills in Tulsa. And I recall that it was so hot there, and at that time they were still playing 36 holes on Saturday. The tournament ended on a Saturday rather than a Sunday. And it was so ungodly hot that, and I didn't make the cut, thank goodness, but the guys that did, and I think there were 60 plus ties playing the last round, 40 of them, only 40 players finished. They were passing out and going by the wayside from heat exhaustion. So that's the first time, I guess, I would have seen Gene Sarazen. I'm sure I probably looked around to see what he looked like at that time. But I have some notes here, and I admire Mary Ann because she just has a terrific memory and can talk unsolicited, unspontaneously. And I've got these notes that I would like to read so that I don't forget what I would like to say. And I would first like to add my thanks to Mary Ann for being here to celebrate Skokie's 125th birthday. And what a wonderful celebration it was. Mary Ann has honored us with her appearance a number of times during the club's annual Gene Sarazen tournament, and we are so fortunate to have you here, Mary Ann, as part of the Skokie family. And before I talk a little bit about my experience with Mr. Sarazen, I would like to brag a little bit about Skokie Country Club, which I believe has emerged under the leadership of Chuck Scussum and John Guy as the premier country club in all of Illinois. Good work, John. For those of you who are relatively new members or members to be, you may not realize what a great history the club has. For instance, Skokie Country Club hosted the 1909 Western Open, 1909. Skokie hosted the 1910 Women's Western Amateur. In 1922, of course, we hosted the U.S. Open. In 1952, we hosted the Women's Western, won by Betsy Rawls. And Andy did a great job in researching that, and some of those memorabilias are on display in the new Skokie dining area. In 1998, we hosted the U.S. Senior Amateur. In 2010, we hosted the Men's Western Amateur. And again in 2017, the Men's Western Amateur. And also in 2017. And finally, coming again in the year 2025, we're going to host the Western Amateur still a fourth time. Of course, the crown jewel of all of this is the 1922 U.S. Open, which Sarazen won at the age of 20. And speaking of Sarazen, here are some interesting facts that I discovered, and I'm sure I'm going to repeat some of what Mary Ann has already said. But Mr. Sarazen was born in 1902 in Harrison, New Jersey, to a poor Sicilian immigrants, and as Mary Ann indicated, his given name was Eugenio Saraceni, and I guess he later changed his name to Gene Sarazen after he turned pro, and then acquired the nickname the Squire. His wife was named Mary. They had two children, Mary Ann and Gene Jr. He signed on with Wilson Sporting Goods in River Grove, Illinois after turning pro, and spent his entire season, or his entire career, with Wilson Sporting Goods. Had 48 professional wins, including 7 majors. He played in 37 Opens, won 2 in 1922 and 32. He was credited with the invention of the sand wedge. He hosted Shell's Wonderful World of Golf for many years on TV. He was the first professional to win the Grand Slam of golf, all 4 majors, the Masters, U.S. Open, PGA, and the British Open. We have that print downstairs that I hoped we could bring up, but it's firmly fastened to the wall. So no
Well,
one
hopefully
can
it's
take it.
insured as well.
I bet it's. But anyway, that print is something that I'm sure is very valuable. And I remember that Bart DiBartolo had those prints made up. He had 3 of them made of the 4 major winners. Of course, there are 5 of them now since Tiger came along. But I'm sure that Bart kept one, and I think, Marianne, your dad has one? Uh-huh. And of course the 3rd one is there. But it was very interesting, I thought, that we had no trouble getting Gene Sarazen and Jack Nicklaus and Gary Player to sign those prints. And we were told by the golf salesman that called on me that Ben Hogan was very particular about what he signed, and very often he got so many things in the mail to autograph that very often he wouldn't do it. So I asked the golf salesman, I said, well, maybe what should we do to ensure that we do get his signature? And he said, well, why don't you call Pat Martin? That is Ben Hogan's private secretary. And perhaps Ben will remember you because in 1952 I had won the Texas Amateur Championship and was the captain of the amateur team, the 10 best players, 10 best amateur players in Texas against the 10 best pro players in Texas, and Ben Hogan was the captain of the pro team. So we had our pictures taken, and I thought possibly Mr. Hogan would remember me, and so I called Pat Martin and relayed that story to her, and I said, would Mr. Hogan possibly honor us with his signature, and Skokie Country Club would be glad to donate X number of dollars to his favorite charity. So she called me back 2 days later and said, Mr. Hogan said he would be most happy to sign those 3 prints, and Skokie doesn't need to donate any money to a charity. So that's how the 4th signature came about. So,
Bill, do you mind if I move us to Skokie, or do you have more remarks?
I have a couple of more.
Okay.
Okay. As you mentioned, he's received so many honors, there's too many to list, but he was inducted into the World Golf Hall of Fame and also voted the Male Athlete of the Year in 1952. As far as my personal experiences with Mr. Hagan, Mr. Sarazen, they were memorable and the greatest, some of the greatest things that ever occurred in my life. I got to play golf with him 2 times, both times here at Skokie Country Club. The first time was in 1952 when he came to Skokie to celebrate our 75th birthday. And we teed off on the first tee. The first thing I noticed was his unusual grip. He gripped the club like you would be holding a baseball bat. The left thumb wasn't even on the club. He did interlock, and I asked him about his grip, and I said, I've never seen a grip like that. And he said, well, that's called the Henry Picard grip. I guess he had an association early on, maybe as an amateur, with Henry Picard, who was the golf pro at Seminole Golf Club in Juno Beach, Florida. And I guess he thought that was the way to hold the club, and as it turned out, I was told that he and Bobby Jones were 2 of the longest hitters of his era, even though he was only 5 foot 5.5 inches tall and weighed like 162 pounds. So that was very interesting to me, and the scorecard that day is on display in the new men's eating area. And I know that he was 69 years old and shot a 73, and I thought to myself, how could a very old man of 61 shoot a 73 on our tough golf course, which was playing about 6,600 yards that day. We only had two sets of tees, the front tees, the men's tees, and the back tees. So I was very impressed with the way he played. And
Bill, you were kind enough to share this wonderful photograph from 1972 of Gene Sarazen and Bill. Are you looking over the scorecard, or you know what you're signing here? I'm not sure what.
that's the day he shot the 73. And that evening, he was awarded a memento in honor of being here for our 75th. I think that pretty much wraps up what I had to say.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
And you keep it. Thank you. And you can still hear me okay, right? So I want to talk about the relationship that you have had, as well as your dad, with Skokie Country Club. We found in the archives that Mr. Sarazen had come back to Skokie a number of times, and so have you. What did Skokie mean to your dad, and what does it mean to you?
Well, of course, I've had a wonderful time and enjoyed meeting so many people, and it's been an honor to come back and to be an honorary member. For Dad, it was his career. Winning the U.S., it was very difficult for him to get where he did at 20 years of age, and to come here and to win and to beat Bobby Jones and to go on. It gave him a whole different life that he never would have had. And he loved Skokie, and as you said, you've all mentioned his trips back there. He really enjoyed it. And then in the early 80s, it's kind of a fun story. He was at Augusta during the Masters at the hotel, and I think he may have been having a drink, and a couple of local people by the name of Walter Holt and Bart DiBartola were also at the Masters, and they also went in and they spotted him at the bar, and one thing led to the other, and it became an association all these years. And I think that it also got him to come back here for these different occasions, because we all saw a lot of Walter and Bart and their families, and we went to different tournaments. So I also had a long relationship with all of them, and unfortunately, we're going to have a lunch on Tuesday, a visit. And looking forward to seeing them again, and hopefully get some more news of things that I have forgotten, maybe, that I'd like to remember to tell about the association here.
That should be fun.
Yes, it should.
In addition, I'm thinking of long relationships that your dad had with certain entities. One that Bill mentioned earlier was Wilson Sporting Goods. He had endorsed their products from 1923 until his death. So can you speak a little bit about his relationship with Wilson Sporting Goods?
When he died in 1999, Wilson said that he had the longest contract still in force of anybody, and they could not find any other athlete that had a 78-year contract that was still in force. And of course, they made his clubs, and they also got a lot of life, so to speak, out of the sand wedge. They made many of those.
Can you talk a little bit about how your dad invented the sand wedge, and then it was mass produced then by Wilson?
Well, Dad, of course, over the years, Dad met people that we only read about in history books. One of them was Howard Hughes, and golf introduced you to who's who Hollywood or other sports or business or whatever. And so Dad really did meet a lot of these people. And Howard Hughes one day took him up in a plane. And however, I'm not a pilot, so I'm not going to try and explain how a plane goes up or down or whatever. But Dad got the idea that the way the plane was going up and down might help with him working. He was having trouble getting out of the sand, and so he decided that if he worked on one of his clubs, he worked on a niblick, and he spent the success he really had came in 1933 down in Newport Richey, Florida. He was down there for the winter, and he worked on that club. And then he went to the British Open at Royal St. George, the Prince's Club, and he won. And he used that club. Today, you really wouldn't be able to fix a little club and put it in your bag and go. And especially, you wouldn't be able to show up in an Open. So.
Well, recently there was someone who was disqualified from an event because their putter grip was not long enough or too long or something. So yes, I don't think you can show up with your own handmade fashion
homemade
clubs. Another wonderful relationship that your dad had was with Shell in the wonderful world of golf. For a lot of average folks sitting at home watching television, it was the first time that they got to see courses on television like Pine Valley or some of these others. Could you describe a little bit about what your dad's relationship was with Shell and that television program? Because it was revolutionary.
He always thought that really, first of all, the shows were, even to this day, those shows were really, it was quite a production. And they went to places all over the world that we only, again, just hear about. Now, today, a lot of those are famous clubs, but at that time, and Dad felt that really kept his name, and gave him another, really a nice career. He was one of the first really on television to do something like that. And what was interesting, he never had a script. There was nobody standing in front of him with a board. Today everything is scripted. But Dad, and of course he didn't want to wear any glasses. He needed a little reading glasses then. But they would say, okay, we're going to talk about, and then they would give him a little idea of what they might like him to talk about. Everything was just ad lib. There was, and they never had to do it over again. They just said it was really amazing that he had a real knack for television.
I think there's part of the secret sauce of what made that program so wildly successful was the authenticity I think your dad brought. And yes, there were good players who were playing, but when you have this legend of golf who's moderating it, but
it's kind of fun today to see some of those people that came out. Now, these were not well-known golfers as such at that time. They were golfers. They were just kind of starting out. But you look and see who played in some of those early shows. And Jack Nicklaus and Arnold Palmer and Sam Snead, and a lot of them did not. They were not. They had not won all their tournaments as we now know them.
Another institution that your dad had a long relationship with was Augusta National. That he was the honorary starter, I think from 1981
Yes.
up until he passed.
Yes.
And I know that you've been to the Masters a number of times. What did Augusta National and the Masters tournament mean to your dad?
Well, first of all, Dad never took anybody in the family until I finally hit 50 years of age in 1986. And Dad said, how would you like to go to the Masters? And I said, I would love it. And so he invited my brother and me to go. And what I didn't know, in order to go to the Masters, even at that time, if you didn't have a hotel room, it was beyond belief to try and find anything that was available, even back in 1986. And of course today, it's the same thing. If you don't have your hotel room. Anyway, it was wonderful. It really was. And of course, being with Dad at the Masters from 1986 to 1999. You know, they were very nice to us, and we had, I could take some friends as the years progressed. I took a lot of my friends and family members, and everybody got to go, and we got to eat in the clubhouse, and we got to go behind the ropes, but there were some fun things. Dad had a car, and my son would drive it. They gave Cadillacs to drive. And so my son would be with him and would drive him and stay with him. But I always was with Dad all those years. Every time when he went in to sign in to play in the Masters, they gave him his credentials, and they always gave me a parking pass. So I was very popular. Those were the years, I don't know. Now when we were able to drive in, there was a nice parking area. And of course, I would go early in the morning. Everybody would go, and then I'd always leave the car unlocked, and everybody would do all their shopping. But anyway, I still go, and I still have a lot of friends. I don't. I do go to the golf writers' dinner, and Dad won a couple of awards back in his day. I do that. But slowing down.
Slowing down. Well, you know, some folks will say that one of the most famous shots your dad ever hit was the double eagle on 15. You know, around here we say it's the second most famous shot from your dad because of the driver off the deck he hit on 18 here to eventually win the 22 U.S. Open.
I could tell you a little bit about Gusto. That spot at the 15th. Now again, they've changed the 15th a lot, but back in those earlier days, back in the 90s, when we all would go, you could hear the players during the practice rounds. You could hear them. They would make mention of the shot, and when they would get ready to hit their next shot, they would say, "Well, I wonder if I can get it on the green." And you could hear a lot of the famous players. And over the years, I had people telling me, say, "Oh, I heard so and so say they thought they were going to try and get it on the green."
That's funny. At some point, your dad, you said that you had located permanently to Marco Island, Florida, where he spent the last half of his life. And the last institution that I'd like to ask you about, because I know it's very fond of him, was Hole in the Wall. What did Hole in the Wall mean?
Yes. Well, when they moved to Marco Island, Dad moved down there because they had this very nice new club, and they were working on the club. But he also had some friends up in Naples, and he would get invited to go up there and have lunch and play. And one of the clubs that he had a number of people that he enjoyed, and they would invite him, was Hole in the Wall. And then a couple of years ago, they started a Gene Sarazen event, and my daughter and I went and met some more of the people, and not some of the same people that had been there when he was. So he really enjoyed Hole in the Wall. He also enjoyed other, he did play he played Royal Poinciana and student.
Bill, any final thoughts about Gene and Sarazen and what he meant to Skokie, in your words?
Well, of course, we will never forget the 100th birthday. When Gene showed up, I think he was 94 years old at the time.
It was in 1997, was
Yes.
it? He would have been 95, yes.
He was 95. Yes. And I got a call, it was over the 4th of July weekend, and I got a call from Bart DiBortolo and said, guess what, I've been in touch with Gene Sarazen for several weeks now, and was hoping he could attend our 100th, and he said that he certainly would if his health would allow. And so I got the call, I think it was a Thursday, over 4th of July weekend. Friday morning, of course, Bart called and said, guess what, Sarazen's going to be here. How would you like to go pick him up? So we jumped into a twin-engine jet at Palwaukee Airport, I think it was owned by the Rolex Watch Company. And I think one of our members, and I don't recall who, was with Rolex, so it was his jet. We flew to Atlanta, and why Gene was in Atlanta at that time, I don't really know. But we picked him up, and Mary Ann's son was working for his grandfather as the full-time valet when he was on the road traveling. So fortunately, 4 of us sat at a card-sized table, and for 2 hours on the way back from Atlanta to Milwaukee, we talked well, he talked and we listened. His recall was just like Mary Ann's, just unbelievable. His hearing was better than mine, and that was quite an experience. And of course, when we got here, and the day came when we were going to celebrate the black tie celebration. It was about 6 or 7 o'clock in the evening, and it was a beautiful evening. There were like 700 Skokie members. No guests were allowed that day. The gals were in their gowns and the guys in their tuxedos, all gathered around behind the 18th green. And quite often, since we're only about a half a mile from Lake Michigan, the fog would roll in across the golf course. So the club had rented this fog misting machine and put it behind the 18th green. And I guess it was Di Bartolo that took Mr. Sarazen down to the 18th tee to show him this memorial that had been erected, a bronze plaque which you've seen on the rock, which Mr. Sarazen had not seen. So waiting for him down there on the 18th tee was a bagpiper. And so all along the 18th fairway, the bagpiper marching along, and I guess your grandson was in the cart.
My son.
Your son was in the cart with Mr. Sarazen. They rode all the way up to the 18th green while the fog misting machine was blowing across, and as I was told, Mr. Sarazen got out of the cart with tears in his eyes. He was so impressed with what the club was doing in his honor. And he got up on the green and he looked around and he says, I remember it well. I was back there about 220 yards from the green. I was thinking about laying up with my 5-iron and my caddy, and he mentioned the caddy's name. Do you know?
Dominico.
He must have been in touch with him through the years because he still remembered his name. But anyway, he said, my caddy taught me hitting the driver out of the fairway. And he's standing there and he says, you know what? He says, I hit that ball right here, 14 feet from the hole, and then I 2-putted to beat Bobby Jones by 1 shot. And that's the part of history that will be remembered forever, at least in our circles. Wonderful memories.
I can add a little something now. He sunk that putt. He didn't 2-putt or anything on it. He, to his dying to the end of his life, he could not understand how people could miss that final putt. And they'd sometimes 2-putt, 3 putts before they'd win a major even. It was funny, there was something about it. Of course, in his years, every dime made a difference. He was very careful with
It was a different set of economic circumstances for a professional golfer in 1922.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Another thing that was always interesting, and we watched lots of golf. I'm a big sports fan. I love football, and I used to watch football with him in the wintertime. big football fan, and my son and I, we would spend a lot of time with him watching it and watching all the golf. But he also never liked when the fellows would mark their ball. He said, we didn't mark our ball. He said, you mark your ball, you wipe your ball, you move it this way, move it. And he was funny to hear him describe it, and especially if somebody took quite a bit of time to do it. Or the ones that would try and set their club down and they maybe move their hips a little or their legs a little or their arm, this, that, and the other. And he would count it. And he was really funny. And as the years went on, he really noticed it. He said, we never did that. That's what he used to say. Miss them quick.
Miss them quick. Well, with that, I think that unless anyone has any questions, Andy?
Can I take the microphone?
I'm not going to say no.
Certainly.
Along with Roger, I was here in July 1997 when your father came up here, and I have a couple of very clear memories about what happened. When your father got on the green, the first thing he said, I believe, was, the trees have grown like crazy. Yeah.
5 times as many trees.
Yeah. And the other thing he said was, and I'll remember this vividly, he said, in a joke, 75 years ago, my grandfather won the U.S. Open on this green. So he was completely, had all his facilities, remembered things vividly, and just really captured the moment in an amazing way. It was such a unbelievable treat for the membership to have him here. It meant everything. So thanks to Bart and thanks to your father for making the effort in his 95th year to be here. It meant everything.
And he said when they took him out to the car, since he was 95, he'd been here like once a decade. He said, I'll see you all in heaven. Because he knew this was the last year.
And unless you have any final remarks, I think that brings us to the end of our session. We sincerely appreciate both of you helping Skokie Country Club celebrate its 125th birthday, as well as commemorating the 100th anniversary of the 1922 U.S. Open.
It's been a pleasure to be here.
It's been so special to have you here.
Thank you. I know Dad would be so pleased with this. And how his name has been kept alive here. He would really have appreciated it. And he did remember that trip to Skokie at 95, and here he had a few more years, and he did talk about it, and it was a big part about it. And of course, it gave me a chance to find out a little more about his association with Skokie.
And his name is going on a very nice new dining room, too.
Yes.
Yes.
If he were here, I hope he would appreciate that the members had allocated the money to redo the dining room in his name.
Oh, I'm sure he would have enjoyed it.
Yeah. Anyway, thank you all for coming today, and thank you for
Thank you for
coming to
having
visit
me.
us in Glencoe, Illinois.
Yes.
Thank you. Bill.